Early, when you hear of a peace talk and you hear of a summit where the two warring sides get together, the idea and the expectation is this is leading toward an end of war negotiations. They're trying to end the conflict, that their two sides they're tired of fighting, et cetera. So they come together for the purpose of, all right, let's find a way out of this. That's what you ordinarily think. What just happened in Istanbul yesterday with Russia and Ukraine seems to be almost the mirror opposite of that. It seems that the two sides came together, put forth documents for the other side to see, term sheets, some call them, that make war more likely, and it pushes the end of the war even further out because it doesn't appear that either side wants a negotiated settlement. That's what it looks like on the ground. And to try to make sense of this and figure out where the U.S. is in all this, where NATO is in all this, is, of course, the ever-popular Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and, of course, a highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Happy to be here. Happy to know I'm popular somewhere because I'm not popular inside the Beltway.
Yeah. That's why I'm outside the Beltway. I'm close, but I'm outside because they don't want me inside. But so I'm happy to be outside with you. I just want your view, first of all, before you even get into some of the outputs of this meeting and some of the statements that some of the leaders said coming out of Istanbul yesterday. What did you expect going in?
Nothing. I think this is a charade. The only people who are serious about finding an end to this are the Russians. The Ukrainian leadership certainly isn't. You're talking about a government that is presiding over a huge graveyard. The numbers of people left in Ukraine are probably less than half of what formerly lived there. You know, you filled up dozens and dozens of graveyards with 1.5 million dead Ukrainian troops. I think it's probably higher than that now. But it's one of these things that until this tragedy ends, we're probably never going to know just how many people were killed. And no one has an interest in telling the truth, certainly not in the West and certainly not in Kiev. So I think it's unfortunate, but it's a charade. And the Russians, I think, feel compelled to play along. The question is, how much longer do they play along? That's all.
And there certainly has been some indications that the play along terms may be coming to an end. We'll get to that in a second. But first of all, let's start off with the ever popular Volodymyr Zelensky, who never has any shortage of things to say and loves the mic. And they put one in front of him after Vilnius. And in this, he first of all took a little bit of crow hopping around and bragging on himself about this spiderweb operation, and then gets into what he says about the Russia war.
I informed our partners about the situation at the front. We also talked about our operation inside Russia, which has seriously weakened their military. Operation Spiderweb showed that modern war really looks like and why it's so important to stay ahead with technology. The key to lasting peace is clear. The aggressor must not receive any reward for war. Putin must get nothing that would justify his aggression. Any reward would only show him that war pays off. Geopolitical gains are just as important to Russia as money or territory. If Putin is allowed to decide who joins NATO, where NATO infrastructure can or can't be, then Russia's appetite for war will only grow.
So let's take a look at a few of those things in sequence here. One of the first ones is he said this operation that attacked 5 Russian air bases, 2 of which got some pretty significant hits on their bomber fleets, was to seriously weakened Russia. Do you agree with that?
No, Russia has not been seriously weakened by any of these. These are PR stunts facilitated by superior American military intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance via the CIA and MI6 to the Ukrainians. People have no idea how large these areas are. I keep trying to tell people, imagine if we were trying to fight a war between Chicago and Philadelphia. That's what you're dealing with in Ukraine. And that's what you've got when you start to look at the borders and the thousands of miles of border that you can't possibly protect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're going to experience these kinds of things. But as far as seriously weakening or damaging the Russian military machine or war effort, they're delusional. It's nonsense.
And let's just follow on with that theme of delusional, because the next thing he shifts to is where these negotiations are going to end, in part because of the presumed military pressure that he just put on Russia, that somehow he feels that's going to compel them and all of those Europeans that are assembled around him there, for Russia to get nothing from this. And he wants them to basically lose, both geostrategically and as every other on the battlefield as well, and specifies in there that the Russian side can't get anything, i.e., no territory. Now, if you're on the Russian side of those equations, what's that going to do to you? Are you going to give in to that?
I think we need to back up and understand something. Zelensky and Netanyahu are two sides of the same coin. What do each of those people want to achieve? They want to achieve the introduction of American military power into their respective conflicts. And that's important to understand. Zelensky's not stupid. He knows the Europeans have very little to offer. He knows they don't have much in the way of deployable combat power. You know, we've talked about their boutique ground forces or Lilliputian armies before. So he's hoping that the United States air and naval power, combined with whatever else we're prepared to send that we've got sitting in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, will turn everything in his favor. Therefore, everything he does is designed to persuade Donald Trump and Washington that there is still life in the Zelensky regime, that they could actually do something. You have something similar with Netanyahu. Both men are trying to stake out ground that make an agreement impossible. Just as Netanyahu has now made it very clear once again to Donald Trump, who has obediently replied and said, yes, you're right, there can be no enrichment in Ukraine. Well, that's the path to war, and that's the path that Netanyahu wants. And you've got something very similar with this man, Zelensky. We're going to fight to the bitter end. There will be no compromise. We will never admit the loss of any territory. So we're going to continue to lie about what we cannot do and pretend that we can do things by capitalizing on the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance we get from the United States, primarily in Britain. And we're going to use whatever they give us in terms of technology or advice to hit points that the Russians can't possibly protect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I think that's what we're up against right now. These are two leaders who don't represent the interests of the United States or the West in any way, shape, or form. And they're both interested in themselves and what they want to achieve. They're both delusional.
Well, and I think that was borne out when the lead delegate for the Ukraine side, Minister of Defense Umerov, came out and he laid out their positions, which he said after the ceremony. Now, interesting as you watch this, if you didn't know anything, if you'd been in a coma for the last 4 years, and you suddenly woke up and saw this video, you would think, wow, if the Russia and Ukraine side are in a war, clearly the Ukraine side is winning, because this is like the superior talking to an inferior.
We've been telling Russia for a very long time, this war must end. And the whole world supports us in that. We're calling for real work to end this war. The first necessary steps are clear to everyone: a ceasefire, humanitarian actions, and preparation for a leaders' meeting. If Russia is serious about ending the war, it will move forward on this. If not, international sanctions must follow.
So, yeah, then again, it repeated the issue. Sanctions, that's what they want. Who sanctions? Of course, the ones from the United States. But then this issue of a ceasefire first, the leaders meeting, and ad infinitum on down the list. Things that they know categorically Russia has no interest in. So really, you can't read it any other way, because if you haven't been in a coma, then you're looking at that and you're going, like you said a second ago, this guy's got to be delusional. So, but let me ask you, is it delusional, or is it just a gamble that, well, we're going to try and pull Trump in? Because if they don't succeed, then these kinds of comments here, well, they won't play well over time.
Well, let's talk about two things that address your immediate question. I think the first thing is that very few people have paid attention to the resignation of the commander of Ukrainian ground forces. And he was widely viewed on the Russian side as one of the few competent people serving in the Ukrainian military. And he resigned, and they made up some reasons for it. But what I'm told is that he's frustrated because he's been continually ignored. He's given good advice. He's recommended certain courses of action. They've always been rejected. And now he's pointed out that the front is crumbling and the future is clear, the complete annihilation of Ukrainian forces on the ground in Ukraine. That's what he says they're headed for. Now, that was not published, and that's not the sort of thing that anybody in Washington is going to admit to. But I think that's much more important than anything else we've heard. There's something else here, and this is something that you can appreciate in particular. I think we all can that have been involved in the disasters, military disasters of the last 30 years in the U.S. military. I guess it's 34 now. And that is something that General David Petraeus said while he was on the ground in Iraq. And he repeated this to several people, and people seemed to think this was a brilliant insight. I thought it was a disgraceful comment and an admission of deceit. But, you know, in retrospect, he turned out to be pretty correct. And he said, what happens on the ground here, meaning Iraq, doesn't really matter. What's important is what people in Washington think. Now, that's what you're dealing with right now. You're dealing with perception, creation, shaping, and implementation. In other words, we're going to create the illusion that there's something left inside Ukraine and in Kiev. We're going to be assisted in this by the Western media, who simply repeat ad nauseum, you know, the MI6, CIA mantras to convince everybody that there's something happening here which isn't. We're going to have these PR stunts, and we're bringing over two senators. Richard Blumenthal, as I recollect, he was someone who claimed to have served in Vietnam, and then it turned out that that was not the case. And then, of course, his comrade in arms, the combat lawyer from South Carolina, and the two of them showed up and charged an enormous hotel bill, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know what they were buying over there, but don't even want to think about it. But having said all of that, all of this is designed to create a perception that there's something happening that really isn't. And I think that insofar as the average American is concerned, who can't really discern what's true and what isn't because it's so confusing, they may have had some success. But the truth is, it's a failure.
And you know, you talk about Gary. I don't know if we have this this B-roll here. We talked about earlier today, but you talk about the stunts and things to get media attention. There was overnight another provocation by the Ukraine side against Russia on an emotionally important that they know issue on the Crimean Bridge, where apparently one of the support structures was attacked from underneath. And it's unknown exactly the extent of the damage here, but that's something that the Ukraine side has been talking about attacking for years. They've been trying to bring it in. Yeah, that's the one right there. Thanks, Gary. And so we don't know the nature of this damage, but something was done underneath it. And this is something that is an emotional issue. But as I understand it, and I don't know what you can shed light on this, that because of the first iterations where they tried to bring down the bridge and actually did blow up with a suicide bomber on it, portion of it in the past, that Russia now doesn't use it as much. They rely on other means to support their troops on the Crimean side. What does this tell you about the situation here?
Well, it doesn't add any more to what I've already said. This is another stunt. Again, people need to ask the question. Some people have. Does this in any way, shape, or form change the reality on the ground in Ukraine? The answer is no, obviously not. I would even go so far as to point out that the bombers that they damaged were very old aircraft that were due to be retired in any case. They've used them for the purposes of delivering these glide bombs that we know about, but they're not entirely dependent upon just those aircraft for that capability by any means. So again, this is just a ridiculous PR stunt designed to create the illusion on the model of Dave Petraeus. We're trying to shape perception in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, that something's happening that really isn't. Now, having said all of that, there's another question that has to be asked, and that is, where is President Trump? Because remember, one of the things that happened as a result of the attack on the bombers is essentially a violation of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement. That was the agreement where we said we would display our bombers on the tarmac. The Russians said they'd display theirs. So there's no question in anybody's mind about where the bombers are and whether or not they're armed or not armed with nuclear weapons and so forth. Well, we've just destroyed that tenet. That's being taken very seriously in Russia, by the way, very, very seriously. And we don't seem to understand that. The gravity of that particular action in Russia is viewed with great fear and anger, because the Russians have been frustrated with our readiness to essentially throw all the arms limitations agreements out of the window. Now, that appeals to the Netanyahu, Zelensky, warmongering crowd in Washington. But it's a dangerous thing that we as Americans ought to object to. But I don't hear anybody raising any objections to that either. What the bottom line is, where is President Trump? What is he doing? Where is his influence? And I think we need to answer that question.
Obviously there's a lot of people waiting for that. He's been surprisingly quiet, even on the issue of the attack on the airfields, et cetera. There was a lot of questions that have been asked here just last night, actually, from Caroline Leavitt. The press corps was pressing her on these issues, and she literally wouldn't even answer. Didn't say anything about what he thought one way or the other. I don't know if that just means they're consulting, they're thinking about it, they don't know how to answer. I'm unclear, but it's one of the rare times where I've seen Trump go silent. Someone who's not silent, though, is the Russian side. If Zelensky thought that the attack on the airfield would cause Putin to quake in his boots and make them to be forced into peace, didn't look like there was any evidence of it with the Russian leader of the delegation, Medinsky, because they published a 12-point plan that came out afterwards. And that's I think it's probably more accurate to say these are terms of surrender. Just running through them real quick for those who can't read that small print. Apologize for that. The Russians basically say there will be permanent Ukrainian neutrality. There will be the termination of all international agreements, i.e. no NATO. Legal guarantees that Ukraine will remain a non-nuclear state. Strict limits on the size, structure, and armament of the military, i.e. demilitarization. Full protection of rights, freedoms of official language and status for the Russian-speaking population, something going back to the Minsk agreements, which Russia has demanded. Legislative bans on what Russia characterizes as glorification of Nazism, the denazification, removal of Western economic sanctions since the start of the war, and on down the list. All of this basically going to say, you will do everything that we say, or and let me just throw this up there. This was the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Nebenzia, who, if anybody had any doubts at all about the significance of these statements, he cleared it up.
As long as Kyiv tries to prolong the war and provoke Russia by striking residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, we will continue our special military operation and destroy objects associated with the military potential of the Kyiv regime. And no new anti-Russian sanctions, arms supplies to Ukraine, or other hostile steps towards Russia will prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The choice is now up to Ukraine. Peace as a result of negotiations or inevitable defeat on the battlefield with different conditions for ending the conflict.
So he just flat out said it. It's either negotiations or defeat. That doesn't sound like a state that feels like it's on the back foot or that it's under military pressure. Is that just posturing on the Russian side, or do you think it's a statement of fact?
No, I think the Russians are stating the facts as they see them. And that's not really directed at Zelensky. Let's be frank. Zelensky's irrelevant. Zelensky's a puppet. He is not a serious state leader by any stretch of the imagination. We know that. I mean, this is the man that has essentially treated Ukraine as a prison and treated anyone in it that didn't like him or didn't support his operations as a prisoner. Now, I think what you're hearing is a statement directed at President Trump, because the expectation in Moscow is that President Trump holds the key to ending the war, and he does. Now, and this is why I brought up President Trump before. If we can say anything about President Trump to this point, it's that he has utterly and completely failed to impose his will on his own administration. Now, what do I mean by that? This is the man that said that he was going to make some phone calls and would end all of this in 24 hours. Well, we found out, and he's found out, that sloganeering and posturing is not a strategy. Sorry, President Trump, but promising to call somebody is not a strategy. He has no strategy. And at this point, he's lost all credibility because in his discussions with Putin on the phone or discussions between his representatives and the Russians and Saudi Arabia have all come to nothing. These promises of a normalization in relations between the two countries and a restoration of some measure of civility in our relations, all of these have come to naught. Yet those are things that President Trump said he wanted. Those are things that President Trump said he supports. So what's gone wrong? Well, nobody pays any attention to President Trump inside his own administration. He's surrounded by people who have their own agendas, and I'm sure that they pacify him, but they're scurrying off in whatever direction they think is appropriate. And it may be that in their minds, they're trying to implement what he wants. But the truth is that there is no executive competence. In other words, there's no way, no method to do any of the things that President Trump talked about. He just can't do it. You know, and this is not news to President Putin. President Putin has pointed out on numerous occasions, I've dealt with several presidents in my lifetime. Remember, he's been there for 25 years, and he discovered something. Whatever the presidents wanted to do didn't happen because the federal bureaucracy, the other members of the federal government, the Senate and the House, they're the ones that are ultimately driving policy. And you have the same thing in the Middle East. It doesn't really make any difference what President Trump says because Mr. Netanyahu can sit there and say, I control 60 senators, no matter what happens. How many senators do you control, Mr. Trump? And the answer is, well, not very many. And right now you have a similar situation with regard to Ukraine. Do you really think these two senators, Blumenthal and Graham, would have trooped off to Ukraine to make this PR stunt more meaningful to the West if they thought they were under a president who was prepared to do anything? Let me tell you something. The president of the United States is potentially a very powerful figure. He can make life miserable for any number of senators or representatives who absolutely refuse to cooperate with him. And thus far, the only name that comes up that's being mentioned as someone that President Trump doesn't like and wants to punish is Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Because Massie won't vote for the stupid bills. He won't vote for the big, beautiful bill that promises to destroy us financially, as Elon Musk rightly pointed out. And he refuses to vote for legislation that creates a special class of human beings in the United States. This is the bill that makes Jews special citizens and makes anyone who criticizes Israel an enemy of the state. He said this is outrageous nonsense. So that's the one the president is going after. Now, this is very strange stuff because I inevitably go back and try to understand what presidents did in the past. And I inevitably end up with Eisenhower because he seems to have been one of the more forthright, clear-thinking individuals. And I go back to the Suez Crisis of '56 and how quickly and decisively he acted because the one thing he did not want and would do everything in his power to prevent was a war with the Soviet Union. And he made that abundantly clear to London and Paris, and in those days to Tel Aviv. He wasn't going to underwrite or support any territorial aggrandizement of Israel. He wasn't going to tolerate the restoration of British imperialism in Africa. And he said the same thing to the French. Now, where is President Trump? You know, from the beginning, I said, fixing this is impossible. We don't understand the complexities at work in the Ukraine-Russian war. He's right. He wasn't there at the beginning. He's been systematically fed utter nonsense about it. He doesn't understand it. And the one thing that he can do to bring this to an end quickly, because he says that's what he wants to do, is to suspend all further aid to Ukraine and withdraw all U.S. forces. That's something he could do and say, Europeans, this is your show. It's up to you. Sit down with the Ukrainians and the Russians and sort this out. We're Americans. We've done all we're going to do. It hasn't worked. We're leaving. That would have worked had he done it early on very, very well. Now he's in a very different position. No one believes anything he says. He's not taken seriously on any subject. And that's happening here at home as well. We could go through a whole list of domestic issues right now where this is occurring. But my point is, he could still do what I said, and that would probably avoid a conflict with Russia. But the situation we have now is one where The Russians are probably now compelled to act decisively in some way. The good news for us is that President Putin is not emotional. He tries to be as dispassionate as he can be about these matters. And whatever they do will probably be deliberate, measured, and decisive. But I think they're reaching the point now where they know that they've got to move decisively in a direction. I think that direction is to permanently remove the Zelensky regime. You can only do that by moving across the river and into Kiev. Perhaps that's coming. He has declined to do that sort of thing because he knows that we are irrational and the Europeans are irrational. We are emotional. We are impulsive. And his concern is, well, the next thing I know, they'll want to commit forces, and that'll mean air forces because there's nobody going to put any ground forces down in Ukraine these days. We're going to commit our air forces in support of the Ukrainians. Well, if that happens, all bets are off. Now you're at war with Russia, and not just Russia, potentially China as well, and a host of other countries. We don't realize how many people have come down on Russia's side at this point. We still have lots of Americans say, well, everyone important is against Russia. Depends on how you define important.
Important, yeah.
So the bottom line is this is a terrible situation. The Russians don't want to have a war with us or NATO or anybody else. They really do want this to end. But we are driving them into a position from which they can't easily escape. They've got to end it.
Well, and to your point here, literally just a couple of hours ago, Dmitry Medvedev put out a Telegram post here that addresses both the negotiations as well as those who are saying, hey, Russia hasn't done anything yet. They haven't responded to this strike on their bombers. Maybe they're not going to. Maybe they're afraid or whatever. And so he writes, to all who are worried and waiting for retribution, you need to worry. This is a normal person's quality. Retribution is inevitable. It is important to remember two things. He says, our army is active, advancing, and will continue to advance. Everything that must explode will certainly explode, and those who must be exterminated will disappear. Then number two, he says the negotiations in Istanbul are needed not for a compromised peace or unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for our speedy victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi government, i.e., to your point you just made. This is the meaning of the Russian memorandum, which was published yesterday. So he flat out says, hey, this is not about, having a negotiated settlement where both sides get give and take. If I said those 12 points look like an issue and an instrument of surrender, apparently to the Dmitry Medvedev and presumably by extension Putin, that's exactly what he intends. What does that tell you about what may be coming next?
Well, I'd hesitate to forecast because, the Russians always do what you don't expect. At the beginning of the war in February 2022, I was very convinced that they would mobilize large forces and they would strike very decisively. The opposite happened. But I do know that they have now added enormous numbers of troops to the contingent in Ukraine, as well as to the position in Belarusia to the north. I don't think there's much that the Russians cannot do if they decide to do it. But again, if they do, they will take all the precautions against the possibility that we would be foolish enough to suddenly commit our air power in support of the Ukrainians. And if people out there don't think that we would do that, they need to guess again. And again, we go back to President Trump. Where is President Trump on this matter? Is he like Eisenhower? Has he made it abundantly clear that under no circumstances will he support a war against Russia? I haven't heard him say that, but that is something he needs to say. He needs to be, unequivocal about our unwillingness to directly intervene militarily in Ukraine. Has he said that? No, he hasn't. So it's a dangerous set of circumstances.
And there are those in Europe that not only are not saying that same thing, they seem to be implying they're given some consideration to move it in that direction. Yesterday, Mark Rutte, who was also at that Vilnius meeting, was speaking to reporters and said a couple of very interesting things. Here, this first one is he's talking about how NATO is still preparing and growing, he says, for war.
We will discuss Ukraine in The Hague and also today making sure that Ukraine has what it needs to stay in the fight, to be able to bring this terrible war of aggression against Ukraine to an end, which has to be lasting, which has to be durable. So all of this will be on the agenda today.
I mean, basically, Doug, he's saying that, he's talking like the Ukraine side is winning and they plan on winning this war. And then we're going to see in a minute that they're talking about building up forces within NATO. But at the same time, this was also being reported that the NATO is saying, hey, we're going to invite Zelensky to the next meeting at The Hague, the NATO summit that's coming up in The Hague here in a little while. And you're like, what? Everybody, to include Trump, has categorically said there's not going to be any Ukraine in NATO now or ever. Kellogg actually went overboard to emphasize that. And yet here NATO is saying they're going to invite him anyway. I don't understand the play here.
Well, none of us do. Two things to consider. First is that President Trump is the de facto leader of NATO, not Rutte. If Trump is serious about avoiding a war with Russia, he needs to pick up the phone and tell Mr. Rutte, thank you for your interest in national security affairs. You are hereby fired, and replace him with someone else who's going to accurately represent the president's views. Again, this is a matter of imposing your will. Did the British complain when we intervened, when Eisenhower intervened and said no to Suez? Of course they did. Were the French upset over it? Of course they were. But they all got the hell out and they did what he told them to do. I think that President Trump is going to have to become involved and exert some influence and show some leadership. You know, that's the first thing. The second part of this is that I would remind Mr. Rutte and his friends meeting in Vilnius that Vilnius in 1812 was the place where the final meeting between Napoleon Bonaparte's representatives and Tsar Alexander I occurred. We all know how that turned out. Alexander I said, no, I'm not going to do what you're demanding. And so Bonaparte marched some 600,000 plus men into Russia, of whom only about 50,000 managed to crawl back out again in 1813. So it's not a good place to hold a meeting in view of that historical backdrop. And I see no evidence that anything that Mr. Rutte is saying is going to move the Russians an inch. Because for them, what happens in Ukraine is an existential issue. That's the thing we have never understood and are unwilling to understand. What happens in that country is of vital strategic importance to Moscow. Ergo, they will do whatever is required to ultimately ensure that their country is protected and will not be subject to future attacks, as it has been over the last several years by Kiev.
Yeah, and we'll see where that's going to go. And what is not going to be helping in that direction is something else that's going on in NATO. And before I get to this next soundbite here from Rutte, where he's talking about that, I'd like your view on something that one of our longtime guests on this, or not guest, but a longtime follower of our show was going back and forth with me earlier today. And I was commenting on the fact that, I was surprised that Russia hasn't done things. For example, we had Jim Jatras on the show yesterday, and he said he was puzzled why Russia never had gone heavy. Like you mentioned, you thought they would come heavy and earlier, or why they haven't knocked out the bridges over the Dnieper, which would nearly starve the Ukraine forces in the east. And this fellow posits that, well, because Russia can and they haven't, because it's basically emptying the coffers of NATO. It's making NATO weaker and weaker by lowering the amount of ammunition they have, because they don't have enough industrial capacity to replace the losses. So the more stuff they give to Ukraine, the lower their arsenals get, and the stronger the balance of power between NATO and Russia continues to go on Russia's side. First of all, I just want your view on how much credibility to that you give.
Well, the second point is worth addressing. Attrition can work in your favor. I think, frankly, it has worked in Russia's favor to this point. But attrition is dangerous because inevitably you too have to give up opportunities. You have to sacrifice resources and manpower in order to pursue your aims in a war of attrition. Even if you win, it's still a very costly proposition. Now, the good news for the Russians is that their economy has grown brilliantly during the last several years. I mean, this is one of the really absurd things that you hear all the time. We're here to hurt Russia and Russia's hurting. You may have shown up to hurt Russia, but contrary to popular belief, Russia really isn't hurting. I would argue that we're hurting here at home economically, and I would say the same thing is true in Europe. But you know, I wouldn't hang my hat entirely on the attrition argument, and I'm not sure that, as satisfying as it may be to see Ukrainians who are not trained fall in on NATO equipment and be destroyed, that is necessarily a long-term strategic goal. I think that goal's already been achieved. I think the objective now is really to bring the fighting to an end. The question is, what's the best way to do that? And I think that's occupying. Now, as far as the bridges go, it always struck me that you should restrict the numbers of bridges across the river. You don't need to bring them all down, because at some point you may want to use them for offensive operations. So if I were sitting on the general staff, I would pick some number of those bridges that have both rail and ground traffic on them. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, I don't know. And then I would point out that we can target whatever masses at either end of the bridge, which means that everyone is canalized now. They can't cross at all these various bridges. But there are some bridges they can still use. And then you can decide whether or not you want to kill everybody that just came across or destroy everybody before they start. But I wouldn't have damaged or destroyed all the bridges. And that's just from a purely military standpoint. And I don't know what the discussion was like in the Russian general staff.
You know, it was one of the interesting things from the first soundbite there from Mark Rutte that I played was he didn't say we're building up in order to try to put pressure on Russia to bring the war to an end. He said to enable Ukraine to keep fighting. So it shows that NATO has no interest in the war coming to an end at all, unless they can somehow win. And then they are, as you'll see in this soundbite, talking about expanding NATO capability.
I can assure you this old 2% we agreed in 2014 is not nearly enough to reach all the capability targets we need to reach, to fill all the gaps we have in our defense system. We can defend ourselves now against Russia, but we can't in 3 to 5 to 7 years. We have seen yesterday the comments by the Chief of Defense of Germany, and clearly we have to stand ready. So it will be considerably more than the 2% we were used to. And we also have to acknowledge that next to the hard defense spending, there is the issue of all the defense-related spending, including military mobility, including are our societies ready, including building up the defense industrial base.
So again, it always seems to get back to money. It always gets back building up that defense industrial base. But let me ask you something, Doug, because you said it just before we went into this soundbite here. The Russian economy over the last 2 years has grown 4.3%, 4.1%. Europe in the last year grew at 1%. Our last quarter, the first quarter of the U.S. was negative growth. We'll see what it turns out in the second quarter, whether we're in a recession or not. But can the West afford to go way beyond 2% of domestic spending and do so in an indefinite period of time?
I think the short answer is no. But let's look at a couple of points here. First of all, when you start talking about building military power, the kind of military power that Russia now has created and fielded, you're looking at 10 years of systematic investment. You're talking about new force designs. Force development is a very tedious and lengthy process. You have to have a strategic vision for it that makes sense. And you're talking about 30 plus nations inside this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And some of these nations are as small as Finland or Norway that have 5 million people. The Swedes, 8 million. The Germans are the largest. And obviously the Germans are the ones that have the greatest interest in terms of building up their military capability now. But even so, that will take many, many years. So the notion that anything you do now is going to have any short-term or near-term impact is absurd. So it's just crazy. It's not going to make any difference, certainly not to the Russians. And then finally, I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is that this man is also engaged in a PR stunt. Everything for Rutte and his friends, optics. They have in Europe, in every government, every nation, a much larger, more complex welfare system and redistribution system for income than we do. It's much more tedious. You have people that, as soon as they can, retire and then live on pretty good pensions for long periods of time and take vacations for the rest of their lives. This is not like the United States, where people work very, very hard for a long time. When they can retire, they've tried to build up their savings, and at the same time, they depend on Social Security. But they're not in a position to go on cruises and take long vacations to the Bahamas or anything else. But that's not the case in Europe. In Europe, people do live very comfortably with very little effort for a long time. That's not possible now. And as we watch the financial crisis unfold here in the United States, you just said, we'll see whether or not we're in a recession. We're in a recession. It's going to be very deep and probably will become a depression. One of the reasons I say that is that Scott Bessent, who is one of the truly intelligent and thoughtful people in the administration, made a statement yesterday, I think, and said, we will never default. Well, when I hear that, that means we're going to default. That's inevitable. So that's coming. When that hits, you have no credit. When you have no credit, you have to radically cut spending, and then the whole society changes. I mean, the whole idea that we don't realize it today, but you have these layover programs at places like Sears and Roebuck and other major corporate entities and Macy's and all these other places. In other words, buy now, pay later, and payment installment plans. All of that goes back to the Depression. Those things were devised during the Depression so that life could continue. It would not continue as well as it had before, but it would be a substitute until prosperity returned. Well, stop and think about what we have today. We're going to lose all of it, and we're not going to be in a very good position for a long time. So to some extent, I've begun to think that people are racing to the bottom. And the question is, what happens first? Do we all go under financially first and watch the economy implode? Or do we go to war and watch everything implode as a result of a war that we're not prepared to fight? I don't know. I mean, I still hear people talk all the time about China, China, China. We have to be prepared for war with China. I mean, you listen to the people in the Pentagon, that's the big strategic change. Well, we're going to put this on hold and that on hold and so that we can deal with China. What, have they lost their minds? You're going to find another war 7,000 miles from home, find another war on the enemy's territory, and that means right off the coast of China. What, you lost your mind? It's crazy. What makes you think the Japanese and the Koreans and everybody else want to be the recipient of Chinese missile attacks? Because we happen to have bases in their countries, especially since none of them want to go to war with China under any circumstances. By the way, the Chinese don't want to go to war with anybody. It's bad for business. Yeah. It doesn't matter. This is the sort of deranged thinking that is popular today in the United States and sadly in much of Western Europe. And at the same time, I think President Putin knows these governments aren't going to last. They're going to go under. They're going to tank. And I know that President Trump probably thinks he's invulnerable and invincible. He's not. This economy could very easily tip over, and we could find ourselves at the bottom of a financial and economic abyss. And then the question is going to be, Mr. President, what do you do now? Threaten more people with tariffs? Threaten to punish other people that do business with people we don't like? What are you going to do? I don't think anybody has any answers. And that's why when Scott Bessent, who I respect, suddenly said, we will never default, it's coming, it's inevitable. Now I know that's where we're headed.
Well, and you keep talking about detached from reality, or just putting blinders on. I don't know what you want to call it, but I hesitate to keep showing it to him. But he keeps providing so much opportunity. Here is Jack Keane earlier today on Fox talking about what Trump should do.
So the leverage has got to be, I think, number one, military assistance, and give them the robust air defense systems and the other things they desperately need. Why is that? Because once Putin sees that the United States is still committed to Ukraine, he knows he can't achieve victory. The evidence is already right in front of us. We're 39 months into the war, Maria. 39 long months. That's how much time it took for us to defeat Nazi Germany. And Putin has not succeeded. He hasn't even taken the entire Donbass region, which is what he wanted to take in 2014. So he cannot succeed if the United States is providing military assistance. He knows that for a fact. Second thing, let's issue the crippling sanctions. That is all part of the process.
Aside from the absurdity of thinking that sanctions are going to work, you addressed that a second ago. What about that comment that he has made there that, my God, it's been 39 months since this war started and we won World War II in about that same amount, and they haven't even taken all of the Donbass yet today. What do you say to those arguments?
Somebody should point him in the direction of some good books. Something that I don't know that he reads them very much. I don't think that's his inclination. That's not to say that Jack Keane is stupid. He's a very intelligent man. What he says makes complete sense when you look at where he's employed and who is paying him. So that needs to be kept in mind. He's not a dumb man. But this business of Nazi Germany, we need to remind everybody that it took the combined efforts and forces of the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. The heaviest material and human losses were obviously taken by the Soviets. That's another issue. But without the United States Air Force, that did something very intelligent. That is, they destroyed the oil refineries and the sources of oil and the oil fields and the pipelines, along with much of the rail that moved it, fixed it so that by July 1944, the average flight time for a German fighter aircraft was about 2.5 hours. And of course, at that point, that was the first time during the Second World War that the Soviets actually could exert air supremacy over the battlefield. Now, I'm just pointing these things out because, we have a very distorted view of the past. Every nation does. If you had lived through the Second World War inside the Soviet Union, you would have not viewed that war as some glorious manifestation of Soviet greatness. Tens of millions of human beings were being slaughtered on a daily basis. 1 million Soviet soldiers were executed by Stalin because they said we're not fighting the Germans. Nobody points that out. There are a lot of things that are wrong with the way all of us look at the Second World War. Eisenhower got it right. He said, we don't ever want to do this again. That was the intelligent observation. And therefore, he said, I'm not going to fight the Soviet Union. And they're not going to fight me because we can avoid that. Right now, we need Trump to stand up and make the same point about Russia. We are not going to fight them. And they don't need to fight us. And we can avoid it. But he has been unwilling to say that. He needs to say that. That's a message everyone in Europe, as well as in Russia, needs to hear. But then there's the rest of it that is just ridiculous, that somehow or another there's anything left of Ukraine. I suppose we could move lots of air defense systems and station them around the cemeteries so that they can still have plenty of room and can bury more Ukrainian soldiers without interference. That's about it. That's the dumbest thing as I can imagine. There is not a shred of humanity right now in anybody who insists on killing more Ukrainians for nothing. And that's why the Ukrainian ground commander quit. He that's it, no more. How many dead does he have to amass on the battlefield in front of him before he says, this is ridiculous?
Yeah, so, that's on top of the fact that there was the 147th Brigade commander resigned 2 or 3 weeks ago. They fired the 59th Brigade commander for a lot of these things. That the wheels are starting to come off. I don't know how much longer this can go, but it looks like we're going to have to find out. In the last few minutes I have here, I wonder if I could switch over to a different topic here that you've alluded to a couple of times in this broadcast already, and that is in the potential for war with Iran. In just the last basically 36 hours, we had very, very contradictory information coming out of the White House. On the one hand, it said, hey, I think we have a good chance to have a negotiated settlement with Iran to avoid war. They could have, minimal reprocessing capacity. And then all of a sudden, I think it was last night, Trump, social truthed out in big, bold letters that there will be no reprocessing capacity, et cetera. And as you mentioned, that doesn't leave much room for anything besides conflict. How do you see that situation at right now?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that President Trump did that. I think he should have said that we in Washington and the United States can live with this reduced processing agreement, and we can. Has anybody spoken up lately in Washington about the numbers of nuclear warheads and missiles that carry them inside Pakistan or India? No. Nobody seems to object to that. What is the objection to just processing anything. That objection comes from Israel, from Mr. Netanyahu and his agents inside the United States. And make no mistake about it, the people that are out there beating the drums for war in this country to attack Iran on behalf of Israel, which is really what it all amounts to, those people are agents for a foreign power. And they're very powerful. They have a lot of money. They helped to put, and some people would argue they did put President Trump into the White House. But I would hope that President Trump would dig down deep inside of himself, recognize that he is an American first, and that Americans want nothing to do with a war that could escalate to the nuclear level. Because how many times do we all need to say it? Russia, China, and others are not going to sit quietly while we and the Israelis pulverize Iran. It's not going to happen. So we will be drawn into a wider conflict with ominous consequences for this country and potentially the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. Again, we just had a president named Biden who admitted at least 30 million illegals into the country who were never vetted, about whom we know almost nothing. And who are these people? Where are they? And what are they capable of? If anyone thinks that a war with Iran is not going to result in serious trouble here at home for us, they're deluded. It's a danger that we cannot dismiss. And right now, we don't have an effective FBI police organization to deal with all of it. And I don't know that we'll ever have one again. We've had so much damage done to these national institutions that people don't trust any longer.
Yeah.
And we don't have an army. Where is the army? I keep saying this to people. 430,000 augmented by how many National Guardsmen and reservists on any given day? That's unserious. That's not real.
Yeah, that is. These are very, very troubling and disturbing things. And unfortunately, it seems like the central theme of all these is that we need the president of the United States to bow up and to stand up for what are American interests, and not to either just be placid and just going along with the winds in the Russia-Ukraine thing, or being pulled along in the Israeli issue with Iran. We need to have an American president that's looking up for us, and he can. And I hope that at some point that he does. But in any case, we appreciate your clarity on this, and we're going to continue to watch it and continue to bring the truth to people on this show. And we really appreciate you coming on today.
Okay, Dan. Thanks very much.
Always a pleasure. And thank you guys.
Check your polls inside the Beltway. See where you stand now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I don't want to look at that scoreboard, but it will age well, though. I think we can confidently say that. So
if we can live that long, right?
If we do, that's always a question. But again, thanks for pointing that out too. And thank you guys very much. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. We really appreciate it when you do. We're going to come back this afternoon, by the way. This whole issue that Trump keeps talking about recently, the Golden Dome, we're going to bring Professor Ted Postol on, who's got some really good insights. As you know, he's been one of our go-to experts on these kinds of missile shields and what the implications are of the attack on the Russian long-range bombers and a Golden Dome issue for protecting the United States. You're not going to want to miss that today at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. We will see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.